At first glance, this looked like another massive comeback for Donald Trump. Cable networks flashed the same narrative across their screens. Supporters celebrated outside courthouses. Allies rushed onto social media, declaring total victory. The Supreme Court restored ballot access. Commentators framed the ruling as proof that Trump had survived yet another legal ambush. And conservative media immediately treated the decision like political resurrection. But when you actually read the opinions themselves, an entirely different story begins to emerge. Because beneath the celebration, underneath the triumphant headlines, hidden inside the narrow wording of the court's ruling, sits something far more dangerous for Donald Trump than most Americans realize. The justices never cleared him. No ruling declared January 6th peaceful. No opinion concluded he acted lawfully during the Capitol attack. No federal authority erased the findings already entered into the constitutional record by courts in Colorado, Maine, or Illinois. Those findings still exist, and that detail changes everything. For months, Trump's public messaging has relied on one central illusion. If he survives procedurally, then history disappears alongside the accusation. His rallies repeat the same theme. His allies amplify identical talking points. Every investigation becomes a hoax. Every indictment transforms into persecution. Every courtroom loss gets reframed as corruption. Yet constitutional findings operate differently from campaign slogans. Once judges place conclusions into official, legal opinions, those conclusions acquire permanence. Future prosecutors can reference them. Congressional investigators can cite them. Historians can trace them directly through public judicial records. Political spin may distort public perception temporarily, but written rulings remain frozen exactly where they were filed. That permanence is precisely why Trump keeps escalating his attacks against the judiciary. Watch the pattern carefully. Whenever a judge rules against him, the response no longer sounds like ordinary political frustration. The language immediately jumps toward personal destruction. Radical lunatic. Agitator. Corrupt. Impeach the judge. The rhetoric does not target the legal reasoning alone. Instead, the goal appears much larger. Delegitimize the institution before the institution constrains presidential power. And now the pressure campaign is intensifying. Recent reports revealed Justice Department officials searching for examples of so-called judicial activism that could justify impeachment referrals against federal judges. Senate hearings openly discussed whether unfavorable rulings should trigger consequences for members of the bench. Simultaneously, Trump continued portraying adverse decisions as evidence of conspiracy rather than constitutional oversight. That combination matters enormously, because democracies do not collapse only through dramatic events. Institutional erosion usually unfolds incrementally. A ruling gets ignored. A judge receives threats. Public trust weakens. Political loyalty starts replacing constitutional restraint. Then eventually, citizens stop asking whether leaders obey the law and begin asking whether laws still matter at all. Against that backdrop, Judge James Boasberg became one of the clearest symbols of judicial resistance during Trump's second administration. After ordering the government to facilitate the return of Venezuelan migrants deported under disputed authority, Boasberg immediately became the target of furious attacks from Trump and his allies. But the remarkable part was not the outrage. The remarkable part was that the judiciary kept moving anyway. Court orders continued appearing. Judges continued ruling. Legal opinions continued entering the record. And somewhere beneath the noise surrounding campaigns, rallies, impeachment threats, and Supreme Court spin, one terrifying reality for Donald Trump remained untouched. Multiple courts had already examined January 6th in detail and concluded that the Constitution itself may still have unfinished business with him. To understand why this still terrifies Trump, you have to go back to the constitutional mechanism almost nobody discussed seriously before January 6th. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, a sentence written after the Civil War. A safeguard designed for a country recovering from internal rebellion. Language created specifically to prevent individuals who violated constitutional oaths from reclaiming federal power. For decades, that provision existed mostly as historical background material buried inside law school textbooks. Scholars debated it occasionally. Constitutional historians referenced it during academic panels. Outside those circles, hardly anyone paid attention. Then January 6th changed that permanently. Suddenly, lawyers across multiple states began examining whether the clause could apply to a former president accused of encouraging efforts to overturn an election result. Legal organizations assembled arguments. Constitutional experts published analyses. Advocacy groups filed challenges seeking Trump's removal from state ballots. At first, many observers dismissed the effort as symbolic theater. That assumption collapsed once actual courts started reviewing evidence. The Colorado Supreme Court did not issue a casual statement or vague political criticism. Judges there conducted an extensive factual examination. Testimony, public remarks, timelines, social media posts, communications surrounding Vice President Mike Pence, and Trump's conduct during the Capitol assault all entered the analysis. After reviewing everything, the court reached a conclusion that detonated across American politics. Donald Trump had engaged in insurrection. Not might have, not possibly, not people are concerned. The ruling used direct constitutional language. And Colorado was not isolated. Maine's Secretary of State independently evaluated the same underlying events and reached a remarkably similar outcome. Illinois followed with additional findings pointing in the same direction. 3 separate jurisdictions, multiple legal authorities, one constitutional conclusion repeating again and again. That convergence mattered psychologically as much as legally. Because Trump's entire political image depends on dominance. His public persona survives through projection, strength, certainty, inevitability. Every rally reinforces the idea that attacks only make him stronger. Every indictment becomes proof of persecution. Every controversy gets converted into fuel for political momentum. But constitutional disqualification carries a completely different kind of danger. Criminal charges can be delayed. Campaign messaging can reshape narratives. Partisan audiences can dismiss prosecutors as biased. A constitutional finding functions differently. It brands. Once entered into official judicial opinions, the conclusion acquires institutional permanence. Future administrations cannot simply erase it through messaging strategy. Cable news cycles cannot bury it completely. Historians decades later will still locate those rulings inside public archives. That permanence created one of the most surreal moments in modern American politics. For several weeks, Donald Trump, the leading Republican candidate for president, was literally removed from ballots in multiple states because courts concluded he may be constitutionally barred from office. Think about how extraordinary that sounds. A former president campaigning for the White House while simultaneously carrying judicial findings labeling his conduct insurrectionary. Nothing remotely comparable exists in recent presidential history, which explains the desperation surrounding the Supreme Court appeal. Trump's legal team rushed toward the justices, not merely seeking political survival, but institutional rescue. Conservative media framed the case as a national emergency. Allies warned about chaos. Commentators claimed democracy itself faced destruction if states gained authority to remove federal candidates independently. Then March 4th, 2024 arrived. The Supreme Court issued a unanimous ruling restoring Trump to the ballot. Headlines exploded instantly. Victory speeches followed immediately. Supporters treated the decision like complete exoneration. Yet hidden beneath the celebration sat the detail changing the entire meaning of the case. The court never overturned the factual findings themselves. Instead, the justices ruled that individual states lacked unilateral authority to enforce Section 3 against federal candidates. Enforcement power, according to the court, belonged to Congress. That distinction sounded technical to casual audiences. For Donald Trump, however, it created an entirely new nightmare. Because the Supreme Court had not destroyed the constitutional weapon aimed at him. It had simply moved the trigger somewhere else. And once that realization settles in, Trump's behavior during 2025 and 2026 suddenly starts making far more sense. Because the Supreme Court did not hand him permanent safety, the ruling merely relocated the battlefield. Instead of 50 states acting independently, the constitutional question now hangs over Congress itself. That means the future of Trump's eligibility no longer depends on state election officials or scattered courtrooms across the country. Everything now revolves around political control inside Washington. That shift transformed every future congressional election into something much bigger than ordinary midterm politics. House races became survival contests, Senate campaigns became protective barriers, control of committees became constitutional insurance, and Trump clearly understands the stakes. Watch how aggressively he campaigns for Republican candidates now. Notice the urgency behind the rallies. Pay attention to the intensity surrounding congressional endorsements. Publicly, the messaging focuses on party unity and defeating Democrats. Underneath the surface, another calculation appears to be driving the strategy entirely. Maintain congressional protection at all costs. Because once the Supreme Court clarified that Congress holds enforcement authority under Section 3, the political math changed dramatically. A future House majority hostile toward Trump would not need another impeachment trial. Lawmakers would not necessarily require a criminal conviction connected to January 6th either. They would already possess something potentially far more powerful, existing judicial findings. Colorado's opinion remains public. Maine's conclusions still stand. Illinois entered its own constitutional analysis into the record. Those documents now sit inside American legal history like loaded evidence, waiting for future use. That reality explains why Trump's attacks against judges keep escalating instead of calming down after courtroom victories. Ordinarily, someone who genuinely feels vindicated lowers the temperature. A confident political figure celebrates, moves forward, and treats the controversy as finished. Trump behaves differently. Every favorable procedural ruling seems to increase the hostility rather than reduce it. Why? Because procedural survival is not the same thing as factual exoneration. And deep down, Trump appears to understand that distinction perfectly. The courts may have restored ballot access, but they also permanently attached a constitutional cloud over his presidency. Every future conversation surrounding January 6th now carries institutional findings that cannot simply be waved away as partisan media attacks. That is what makes this period so historically unusual. America has seen scandal before. The country has experienced impeachment proceedings before. Presidents have battled prosecutors, journalists, and congressional investigators many times throughout modern history. But this situation feels fundamentally different because the conflict now involves competing definitions of constitutional reality itself. One side argues Trump survived legal scrutiny and therefore stands fully cleared. The opposing side points toward the actual text of court findings that were never overturned on their merits. Meanwhile, federal judges continue warning publicly about growing intimidation campaigns targeting judicial independence. That last piece may be the most alarming development of all. Judges almost never speak this way. Federal courts traditionally operate through restraint and institutional distance. Members of the judiciary rarely enter political conversations voluntarily because credibility depends heavily on neutrality. When senior judges begin openly comparing anti-court rhetoric to tactics used inside authoritarian systems abroad that signals genuine concern within the legal establishment. Chief Justice John Roberts recognized the danger as well. After renewed impeachment demands targeting judges who ruled against Trump, Roberts issued unusual public reminders, emphasizing that impeachment is not the appropriate response to disagreement with judicial decisions. The statement sounded restrained on the surface. Beneath the careful language sat an unmistakable warning. The judiciary was feeling pressure, and still, despite the threats, the rulings kept coming. Judge James Boasberg continued issuing orders. Federal courts continued reviewing deportation disputes. Constitutional challenges continued moving through the system. That persistence may be exactly what frustrates Trump the most. Because throughout his business career and political rise, pressure often forced opponents backward. Critics folded, institutions hesitated. Republican officials eventually aligned themselves with his demands. Public intimidation repeatedly produced results. The federal judiciary, however, operates differently. Lifetime appointments reduce electoral fear. Written opinions create permanent records. Constitutional language does not disappear because rallies grow louder. And somewhere inside that collision between presidential power and judicial independence sits the central question haunting American politics right now. What happens when a leader stops treating constitutional limits as legitimate obstacles, while courts continue insisting those limits still exist? That question is no longer theoretical. You can already see the outlines of the confrontation forming in real time. Every court order directed at the Trump administration now carries tension far beyond the individual case itself. On paper, many disputes appear technical: deportation procedures, executive authority, ballot access, constitutional interpretation. Beneath those legal categories sits a deeper institutional struggle over whether independent courts can still impose meaningful limits on presidential behavior. Judge James Boasberg's clashes with the administration illustrate that conflict perfectly. After ruling that deported Venezuelan migrants must be returned because the removals violated legal standards, Boasberg immediately became the target of an aggressive political counterattack. Trump publicly labeled him a radical activist. Allies amplified calls for impeachment. Conservative commentators framed the judge as part of a broader conspiracy against executive authority. Yet none of those attacks altered the underlying ruling. That distinction matters enormously, because authoritarian pressure campaigns usually rely on one core assumption: institutions eventually retreat when intimidation becomes intense enough. Courts become cautious. Officials begin calculating personal risk. Public servants quietly avoid confrontation in order to preserve careers or physical safety. Instead, the opposite pattern appears to be unfolding here. Federal judges continue issuing written opinions despite escalating rhetoric. Appellate panels continue reviewing constitutional disputes despite threats from political allies. Members of the judiciary continue speaking publicly about institutional independence even after becoming targets themselves. That resistance explains why Trump's language keeps growing sharper. Frustration rises whenever power encounters a barrier it cannot fully dominate. And for perhaps the first time in Trump's public life, the obstacle confronting him is not merely political opposition. The obstacle is permanence itself. Court findings endure. Judicial archives remain accessible. Constitutional analysis survives election cycles. Campaign messaging can reshape public emotion temporarily, but legal records preserve factual conclusions long after rallies end. That permanence may become extraordinarily important after the 2026 midterms, because the constitutional danger surrounding Trump has not disappeared. It has simply entered a waiting period. If Republicans maintain congressional control, the Section 3 threat likely remains politically dormant. If Democrats regain the House or both chambers, the entire conversation changes immediately. Congressional hearings could reopen constitutional eligibility questions using already existing judicial findings as evidentiary foundations. And unlike impeachment proceedings, the political optics would look entirely different. The debate would no longer center around criminal guilt alone. Instead, lawmakers could frame the issue as constitutional enforcement rooted in previous judicial analysis already entered into the public record. That distinction would allow future congressional actors to argue they are not inventing accusations, but responding to findings multiple courts already reached independently. Trump clearly recognizes that possibility. Why else campaign with such relentless urgency for congressional races? Why else treat every House seat like a personal survival issue? Why else continue attacking judges, even after procedural victories supposedly settled the matter? Because none of this feels settled from his perspective. The danger remains alive. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this entire story. Donald Trump returned to the White House, believing political victory would neutralize the constitutional crisis surrounding January 6th. Instead, the crisis followed him back into office. Judicial findings still exist. Court rulings continue accumulating. Federal judges continue resisting intimidation. Constitutional mechanisms remain available for future use. In other words, the system never fully closed the file. That reality leaves the United States entering one of the strangest periods in modern constitutional history, a sitting president governing under the shadow of unresolved judicial findings, labeling his conduct insurrectionary, while simultaneously attacking the legitimacy of courts still capable of constraining him. No modern presidency has operated under conditions quite like these. Which brings us to the final uncomfortable truth underneath this entire saga. Donald Trump may have survived prosecutions. He may have escaped disqualification temporarily. He may have regained political power, but survival and vindication are not the same thing. Because somewhere inside government archives, court databases, appellate records, and constitutional opinions, the phrase "engaged in insurrection" remains attached to his name permanently, and no rally crowd on earth can vote that sentence out of existence.